Hello chess fans, this is Rick from Chess to Impress. It's going to start in exactly 1 month from today. On November 9th, Magnus Carlsen will start the defense of his World Championship against Fabiano Caruana. We keep counting down, building up towards a great match on Chess to Impress. By looking at the previous 46 events for the World Championship, we have arrived in 1981. The world champion is Karpov. He defended his title against Korchnoi in 78, and in 81 Korchnoi qualified for the world title match again. These were the candidate matches for that cycle. We had 3 former world champions in the lineup for the candidates matches. Viktor Korchnoi beat one of them. He beat Tigran Petrosyan. Lev Polugayevsky beat Misha Tal. Portis and Spassky could not be separated in their quarterfinal match. In the end it was Portis who went through because he had won more games with the black pieces. And Robert Hübner beat the Hungarian Grandmaster Andras Adorjan. In the semi-finals Korchnoi overcame Polugayevsky and Hübner beat Portis. The final was over 16 games. Korchnoi against Hübner, but Hübner forfeited after 8 completed games and 2 games were adjourned. Hübner took an early lead. After 6 games he was a point ahead, but then disaster struck in Game 7. Here Hübner is white, Korchnoi is black, and white has just played the king to d4. The position is equal. There's not much material left. Korchnoi played rook f4, and now almost every move keeps the game in the balance, but not this one. Hübner played 63 king d4 to d5. And I'm sure you see the refutation. Korchnoi saw it as well. Knight e3 check. Picks up a full rook. Hübner resigned. Korchnoi also won game 8. And as I said, 2 games were then adjourned. But they were never completed as Hübner forfeited the match. So Korchnoi back at the top to play Karpov for the world title again. The match was held in Italy in Merano. First player to get 6 wins with draws not counting would win the match. Viktor Korchnoi was distracted by political issues with his wife and son still being in the Soviet Union. Korchnoi himself had defected from the Soviet Union in 1976. He took the opportunity of the match to publicize the situation of his wife and son, drafting an open letter to the Soviet government to release them both, but to no avail. We have a color picture, the first color picture I can present to you of a World Championship match. World Champion Karpov on the left and Viktor Korchnoi, the challenger, on the right. Things did not go well for the challenger in the early part of the match. Before he knew it, he was 3-0 down after only 4 games. Then he won a game, and we're going to look at Game 9, which was played on the 24th of October 1981. White is Korchnoi, black is Karpov. The score is 3-1 in Karpov's favor. Korchnoi opens c4, e6, knight c3, d5, d4 and bishop e7. We are in a queen's gambit declined. Knight f3, knight f6, the bishop goes to g5. Karpov kicks the bishop, which stepped back, and Karpov castled. Rook c1. The idea behind this move is that if black plays b6, then the rook is nicely positioned to attack the backward pawn on c7. I'm taking the comments I'm giving in this video from the book On the Match by Grandmaster Raymond Keane. D takes c4 from Karpov. He finds a nice solution to the problem of the c-pawn by turning the game into a queen gambit accepted position. And he will play up his c-pawn on the next move, as we'll see. e3 from Korchnoi. And there comes c5. Korchnoi takes his pawn back. C takes, and now knight takes d4 is a move and avoids the isolated queen pawn position that we'll see in this game. Korchnoi decided to go for that isolated queen pawn. E takes d4. Knight c6, and we have reached a version of the queen's gambit accepted opening which was played 100 years before in games of the first world champion Wilhelm Steinitz. Black will attempt to put pressure on the isolated pawn, while white hopes for attacking chances based on his free development and the outpost on e5 for his pieces, as Keane writes. Korchnoi castled, and knight h5. Another option that Keen gives is knight b4, followed by knight d5, blocking the isolated pawn, but Karpov plays knight h5, deciding that his blocking strategy can be furthered by the exchange of the dark squared bishops. In general, exchanges tend to favor the player who is fighting against the isolated queen's pawn. The owner of that pawn should avoid piece swaps and play for the attack, as Keen writes. So Karpov is able to get a pair of bishops off the board. Bishop b3, knight f6, knight back to where it came from, and knight e5 on that outpost. Bishop d7 developing, queen e2, and rook c8 on the open file. Here rook fe1 is given by Keen as being consistent, and now he gives this variation. Bishop c6 is not possible now because white suddenly has the shot. Knight takes f7. Rook takes, queen takes e6, which is winning for white. So rook fe1 is the consistent option here, but Korchnoi plays knight e4, offering another piece exchange, which does not follow the rule of thumb that white wants to keep material on the board. Another piece disappears off the board, and now bishop c6, hitting the queen. Korchnoi took, rook takes, and here the best way to play for white is rook takes c6, knight takes, and then d5, liquidating all the tension in the center. E takes, bishop takes, and this position is very, very equal. But after rook takes c6, Korchnoi plays rook c3, which gets a question mark from Grandmaster Keen. He writes, having forfeited the initiative, it was high time for white to look for a draw. And indeed, he could have achieved that draw with rook takes c6 instead. But rook c3 was played. Queen d6, g3, the other rook in the center, attacking now the d4 pawn with two pieces. It's only protected by the queen. So rook d1, protecting the d4 pawn, and now look at this move, typically Karpov, rook b6. Very subtle. White omitted to swap this rook, and now black reorganizes his major pieces to triple up the attack on d4. And I found a quote from International Master Watson, who wrote, from this point on, Karpov plays one of the best technical games in World Championship history. Let's see what happens. Queen back to e1, queen d7, making room for the rook to triple on the d-file. Rook cd3, there goes that rook. Queen e4, protecting the pawn 3 times now, and queen c6. It's not good to swap the queens now, because then either b takes e6 followed by knight f5 winning the pawn on d4, or knight takes c6, and then in case of d5 there is knight b4 also winning that pawn. So swapping the queens is not good. Korchnoi saw that and played queen f4. Knight d5, queen back to d2, queen b6, and here white should have played a3 according to Grandmaster Keen. He gave this variation, knight e7, bishop a2, knight f5, attacking the pawn 4 times now. So the pawn has to be played up, and then e5, king g2, knight d4, and rook e1. According to Grandmaster Keen, this is a slightly uncomfortable position for white, but one that could still be held. But Korchnoi made a mistake. He took the knight, and Keen calls it an amazing positional blunder, which leaves him with nothing to counter black's onslaught against the isolated queen's pawn. Karpov took with the rook, rook b3, and now taking the pawn is not good because of rook takes queen, rook takes queen, rook takes, and rook takes b7. This is equal. So after rook b3 you have to play the queen, Queen c6, Queen c3, and Queen d7. And Korchnoi felt he had to play f4 here. It's loosening the diagonals around white's king, but this move is necessary as black was threatening e5, and then the pressure against the d4 pawn is too much. That pawn is pinned. Here, taking the pawn does not work again for black because of rook takes, queen takes check, queen takes, rook takes, and white can take on b7 again with an equal position. So after f4, Karpov played b6 to cover that pawn. And now he does threaten to take on d4. Korchnoi played rook b4, a clumsy move, but the only way to protect the d4 pawn for a third time. And now look at this move, b5. Karpov plays b6, and on the next move he plays b5. Very pretty. The threat is now a5, and the rook on b4 will have to give up the protection of the d4 pawn. So Korchnoi played a4, b takes a4, queen a3, a5 hitting the rook, and the rook takes the pawn. Queen b5, very strong move, threatening to come into white's position with queen e2. So rook d2 was played by Korchnoi, and another hammer blow, e5. Wonderful technique from Karpov. White's pieces are either pinned or out of action on the queen side, and black now switches to an attack against white's king. F takes e5, rook takes e5. If you take that rook, then rook takes d2, and both black's pieces will be getting to the second rank. Black will win. So after rook takes e5, queen a1 was played by Korchnoi. A pathetic square for the queen, but white really had to stop rook e1. Queen e8, renewing the threat of rook e1 that will win the queen. Korchnoi now took the rook on e5, rook takes d2, and if you play queen e1 here, that's a variation given by Grandmaster Keen, then there is queen d7. And again there's a threat of rook e1. Black wins here. Korchnoi took on a5, he was in terrible time pressure here, this is move 39, the time control was on move 40, and queen c6. Threatening checkmate, and the 40th move from Korchnoi is rook a8 check to get to the time control. King h7, and here the game could have been adjourned, but the players played on. Korchnoi had just made the time control, Karpov still had 36 minutes left on his clock at move 40. Queen b1 check from Korchnoi, and now the quickest way to win is rook c2. A nice self-pin move, that rook is now pinned. But black is threatening mate on g2, so queen f1 is the only move, and then rook c1 wins the queen. But Karpov played it differently, he shielded the check with g6, and queen f1 was played, queen c5 check, king h1, and the last move of the game was queen d5 check. Korchnoi resigned here without adjourning the game. Let's see why he resigned. If you play king g1, then black should not take the rook, because then white gets his draw. After queen takes f7 check, he has a perpetual. King h8, queen f6 check, king h7, and queen f7 check. After queen f6 check, you cannot go to g8, because then it is white who will win this game of chess. Queen takes g6 check, white will pick up the black rook with some checks. King f8, another check, king e7, and queen takes d2, and white has 4 extra pawns and will win this game. Karpov was not going to fall for that, of course. So after king g1 you should not take the rook, but simply win white's queen with rook d1. This game was over, and it was 4 wins to 1 in Anatoly Karpov's favor, and we only had played 9 games in this match. And it was all over very soon. Korchnoi kept battling, made a few draws, even won game 13, but then lost game 14 and also game 18, and the match was over. After only 18 games, Anatoly Karpov remained world champion. And 3 years later it was the turn of a 21-year-old named Garry Kasparov to take on the world champion. As you can see, they played 5 matches against each other in the space of 6 years. That was quite a rivalry. And we'll cover the first of those matches in the next video. Hope you enjoyed this video on the second Karpov-Korchnoi match. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, please subscribe to the Chess2 Impress channel, and please leave a comment. I will read them all and I will reply to them all. If you like the video, if you like the series of counting down towards Carlsen-Caruana, please share the video and the series on social media by clicking the share button on YouTube. The link to the series is here, and this is Rick for Chess2 Impress. Thank you for watching.